These last 2 mornings, I've woken up at 4:30 in the morning to train at 4:45, 5 o'clock. And I can tell you something. I think it's far more natural to wake up 4:30 in the morning and go deadlift than it is to squat. Deadlifting just comes naturally. I think everyone with an able body can deadlift. Whereas squatting, especially 4:30 in the morning, is rather difficult. You've been sleeping, well, in my case, I've been sleeping for like 5.5, 6 hours. But you've been sleeping for a period of time, which is basically inactive body repairing. And then you wake up, and then within 20 minutes of waking up, you're supposed to be loading a full range of motion, perfect posture, squat, which is very, very difficult. It's far more doable to do a deadlift straight out of bed. It's far less range of motion, and you're using the same damn muscles that you'll be using in the squat. Maybe slightly different loading percentages for some of these muscle groups, but it's basically the same muscle groups used. Because of this, yesterday and today, I've woken up and I've had an extra bit of a poppiness about me coming into the garage to train, because I know I'm going to have an excellent time getting to these positions. There's absolutely no requirement for me to get into these positions. It's just easy. Some mornings, especially 4:30 in the morning, I'd walk in here, and if the first thing I'm doing is squatting, it can be quite difficult to get into these positions. Some mornings, the ankles are short, the hips are short because of this inactivity, and I have to get into these positions and load it up to 80%. Very, very difficult. Sometimes when I wake up this early in the morning, the bar feels crap, 60 feels crap, and then 100, 140, 180 starts to feel good, because basically the weight on my shoulders compresses some of these joints into position. And then I can kind of get into these biomechanical kind of better positions than with an empty bar. With an empty bar, there's not a lot of weight on my shoulders, and I kind of need to passively get in there. With weight on my back, it's kind of like a direct pressure on my back, and then I get into these positions. With the deadlift, it's a beautiful feeling. It's a hip hinge, and there's nothing else to it. There's no mobility restrictions for me to get into these positions. Today I decided to do triples, so worked up to 160 kilos, and I did 5 sets of triples. So 5 triples, that felt good. I noticed, I did some reading last night about Bob Peoples, and he basically never did anything above 5 reps, but he said that he spent some time doing triples as well. So that's kind of where I got the idea last night to do this. I think some sort of variation in the rep ranges that I use is probably good. It gives me a rest from, I guess, heavier weights day to day, but especially on these kind of early mornings where basically I think my body prefers to do more reps than intensity. And so I think triples is like a nice little kind of medium range where you get a couple of reps under your belt, and you keep the weight down, and it kind of all feels good. But that's what I did this morning. I came in and I was feeling excited to come in deadlift because I know I'm not going to have a difficulty warming up. And then when I finally got to the squat, well, guess what? The squat was feeling excellent. Everything's warmed up. I've said this many times in the past. When your glutes are warmed up, you're going to have an easier time squatting. The glutes are very, very strong. They're probably the strongest muscle group in the body. And if those guys are not warmed up and you are trying to get into a full hip flexion position, you're going to have a tough time if those guys don't release. Now, when I say release, I don't mean you shove tennis balls, lacrosse balls into it and you kind of relax it like a myofascial relaxation. I'm talking about a relaxation through warming up of the muscle. We know that when the muscle is cold, it's shorter. When it's warm, it's longer. So it's about the warming up of the gluteal muscles for them to release, and you can get into some of these better positions. Now, in order for you to get into this deep hip flexion, which an ATG squat is, the glutes need to release, right? Glutes are hip extensors. And so when they're really short, you are more likely to be in a hip extension position rather than a hip flexion position. So the deadlifts do that for me. They do that for me, and they make the knees feel really good as well, because as I've kind of discovered when I kind of fixed up my right hip pain, the glutes finally, still I find this amazing. They not only insert into the femur, they come from like the pelvic region, and the sort of region from the pelvis, the sacrum kind of area, and they kind of insert into the femur partially, and part of it also inserts into the iliotibial band. Now for me, the ITB has been notoriously kind of like a silent partner in my right hip pain. And that's because when you have really tight gluteal muscles, they pull on this IT band, and with it, they pull all the other structures which the IT band is attached to. And one of those structures is the tensor fasciae lata, the TFL. Now, the TFL is a tiny little guy. The glute is a big, big guy. So what do you think happens when the glutes are upset? The TFL also gets upset because it's being muscled out of position. Because if this structure, this ITB, connects the two, when one gets really tight, it's going to pull the weaker one along with it. And so that's what I think was happening with my right hip pain. I was getting all of my pain in my kind of TFL region, nothing in the glute. And my diagnosis there is that the glutes were tight because of heavy frequent squatting, and it was pulling the TFL. And sometime when the right hip pain was real bad, it would radiate down to the lateral knee, the outside of the knee. That was kind of the worst of it. Sometimes it would travel even beyond the right knee, kind of into the anterior tibialis region. And what I found was when I would warm up my glutes really, really well, kind of like today with all these deadlifts, it would go away. And not only that, when I go to squatting feels like absolute butter. So in a way, because of all of this, you need happy glutes to have happy TFL and happy IT band. The IT band is kind of like this glue that's poured on the outside of your leg. And that glue binds everything up together and gets upset, and you get symptoms kind of on the lateral part of your leg when there are forces pulling on it. When everything is relaxed and happy, there's no forces, and you kind of feel like butter. And so you can move through these ranges of motion with no problem. Deadlifting is such a small range of motion compared to the ATG squat, and it's a perfect introduction to the ATG squat, especially in these early mornings. This is one thing that I've kind of observed in Olympic weightlifting. Every time I see those training hall videos from the Russians or from the Chinese or whoever really, every time I see them, they kind of always start with the snatch. So they come in, they put their shoes on, they do a couple of mobility kind of exercises, and then they start kind of working on these kind of snatch variations. And then they work up to a whatever number they want to do with the snatch. And then they strip the bar back and they start doing the clean and jerk. Once they finish the clean and jerk, they strip the bar back, often get the squat racks with the squat stands in, and then they start doing the squats, usually front squats and then back squats or whatever the case might be. The point is that they always start with two pulls. A snatch is a pull, very much so similar to a deadlift, right? Because it's all in the hips, it seems as though to me. Whereas the clean and jerk is more kind of like you're less bent over in a way, because the snatch, you've got a really wide grip on the bar, which means that you are really leaned over when you first pull the bar. So it's kind of like you go from a really bent over position to a really upright position in terms of the exercise order. Now, when I realized that, I was like, okay, so maybe I should start doing pulling before squatting, because none of these guys are walking out of the car or waking up straight out of bed and going straight into a front squat. None of them are doing that. Maybe some guys who are like gifted with mobility, but that's kind of where the seed was planted. And so one of the ideas, especially when I was training early morning all the time, like the last 2 days, this was one of the observations that I made, is that when I worked on the posterior chain, when I worked on these pulling exercises and pulling variations, and I did a lot of them, from good mornings to deadlifts to RDLs to you name it, I did it all. There was like a repeating pattern there, that every time I did a pulling exercise before squatting, my squatting felt good. Now, obviously, if you do that, if you do a deadlift, an RDL, a good morning, first, and then you go to the squat numbers will suffer because you're pre-fatigued and you're pre-exhausted, depending on how hard you push it. This is where they always say the squat is an accessory exercise for the Olympic weightlifters. And now, I used to hear that all the time, and I used to think to myself, well, what does that even mean? All that means is that it's not like they don't pick it as a first few exercises for the day. It's always kind of tucked in at the end. And what happens at the end of the session? You're warm, you feel like butter, you get into ATG easier. Like I always feel at the end of the training sessions that I feel like I can just effortlessly get into an ATG. Get me in the start, a lot more difficult. So if you want to have an easier time ATGing, just tuck whatever you're doing, tuck the squatting at the end of the sessions. And wherever it is, whatever the exercise is, you're going to be warm and ready to do the ATG. It's kind of like counterproductive and counterintuitive to put the ATG squatting, the most difficult mobility exercise or mobility requiring exercise, to put it right at the front at 4:30 in the morning on a cold morning. You've just woken up from a sleep. It's like the worst mix possible, and that's what you're doing. And so it's kind of like there's like I've spoken about this. There's a natural, most optimal exercise order that we should all kind of follow. And it's taken me a little while to kind of work out what the best part is. And so when you are squatting every day, I said this kind of yesterday in the last few days, when you are squatting every day, it's all well and good, but that's like taking one ingredient out of a dish and expecting to make the same dish. You can't. Ivan Abajev was not a silly man. He had his guys snatching and pulling and doing all sorts of stuff every day. He wasn't just squatting. If it was just squatting and I was still struggling with my squat and my mobility at 4:30 in the morning, then I could maybe say it's a problem of mine. But if I was in that training hall with Ivan Abajev right now, 30 years ago, I'd probably come in and I don't know, I'll have to look at the training logs again. But when they're training so damn often as well, 3 times a day, like, they start with a snatch, start with a clean and jerk, blah, 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 and then at the end they do a squat. And then you know what I mean? Like, so I think there is a pattern here. The pattern is, I've said this kind of before, start with a pull, start with the exercise which is most bent over in the hip, and then progress it to something that is most vertical spine in terms of position. And that's certainly what we see. Snatch, clean and jerk, back squat, front squat. That's kind of the flow. So that's kind of my observation. This is why I've been feeling really good squatting in the last 2 days. Even yesterday I hit 180. At whatever it was, 5:30 in the morning, 5:45 in the morning. In recent times, I haven't been training this early, but every time I did train this early, because I've kind of lost my way with warming up and all that and being exposed to these early morning sessions on a cold morning, I kind of started losing some of the mobility and some of that poppiness that I would feel. And so my numbers in the morning have been kind of 140, 160 and whatnot. Yesterday, I worked up to 180 kilos on the deadlift for 5 singles. By the time I got to the squat, man, I was feeling fantastic, man. I was feeling fantastic, and that kind of eventuated into a really nice squat. And even so, today, I worked up to 160 kilos for 5 triples, even more work. Now, today, I have to admit, a lot of the deadlifting I was feeling in my lower back. Feeling in the lower back. I don't know why that is. One of the reasons I'm thinking is, well, the deadlifting hits all your posterior chain, and notoriously, I keep hearing it, the lower back is the slowest recovering muscle out of the bunch. So I guess from our point of view, when you're doing an exercise, whatever the muscle that gets fatigued first is probably going to be the weakest muscle, which is interesting. Which is interesting because for people like, excuse the pun, for people like Bob Peoples, who are laborers and spend most of the day laboring, they probably have a really strong lower back. So he probably had a lower back of steel, And by the time he got to the deadlift, he was probably feeling it in the hamstrings or the glutes or whatever. So just an interesting observation. Anyway, guys, I have to wrap this up. I need to go to work, get ready. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.